For centuries, statesmen and philosophers argued over the nature of basic rights. But today, there is general consensus that people everywhere, regardless of race, religion, or sex, deserve certain inalienable rights, human rights.
Certain rights are universal. Among them, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and the freedom of citizens to choose their own leaders. These are not American rights or Western rights. These are human rights. They stir in every soul.
These rights include freedom from oppression, torture, and discrimination. Many also believe that economic and social rights are human rights.
The very right to be human is denied every day to hundreds of millions of people as a result of poverty and the unavailability of basic necessities such as food, jobs, water and shelter, education, health care, and a healthy environment.
Human rights are not just civil and political, but they're also economic, social, and cultural. Not just freedom from fear, but freedom from want. In short, human rights are interdependent, they're indivisible.
And yet, every day, people around the world struggle to protect their human dignity.
Around the world, in every country, discrimination remains widespread. We see it against women, against migrants, against minorities, and against those with disabilities. We see institutional racism, gender stereotyping, and full-blown ethnic wars.
Out of the ashes of World War II, the United Nations was formed, forging a new consensus that premised international peace and security on mutual respect for the rights and freedoms of all. Not long after, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created. It pledged to respect equal and inalienable rights. A half-century later, human rights remain just as central to global peace and stability. But threats to human rights persist. From the push for equality for women and girls and an end to gender-based discrimination.
Let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
To limits on freedoms of expression.
像我这样的人在中国的生活，我觉得用我的讲就是说，就是在两个监狱里，除了有围墙的小监狱，进的就是没有围墙的社会的这个大监狱。我的电话、我的电脑，包括我的行踪等等，都会被公安局，都会被中国的安全部门公安局监控。
From state-sponsored violence and impunity for those in charge, to repression and limits on political participation.
Not just in Burma, but in other countries, all over the world, people have been detained for their beliefs, and detained in a way which is not in conformity with the rule of law.
And also limits on workers' rights.
I was talking to workers who worked in the garment sweatshops. They said, the people who employ us treat us like we are less than human, like we don't exist. Please ask them to treat us like human beings. That's my simple understanding of human rights.
Today, the United Nations works to strengthen human rights protections and to punish the worst offenders, through the Security Council and the Human Rights Council.
Sabemos que o tratamento dos direitos humanos é dos principais desafios do sistema multilateral. A criação deste Conselho representou avanço importante.
And the UN is but one actor in a large field, including NGOs, international tribunals and courts, and individual activists.
One of the great strengths of the human rights movement is that in almost every country, you do find local human rights activists.
Some of the people who worked in our campaign could only work maybe an hour a month. They could maybe volunteer that much. There were others like myself who were full-time. But it was the actions together of all of us that brought about that change.
Over the years, efforts to promote human rights have enjoyed major successes, including the end of apartheid, greater corporate responsibility, the spread of political participation and democracy, including the Arab Spring, and the acknowledgement of our common responsibility to prevent and stop the most egregious human rights abuses. But for every success story, major challenges remain that threaten the global human rights regime. First is the tension between political and civil rights, largely promoted by the West, and economic and social rights, emphasized by the developing world. Some countries and international bodies argue that the same standards cannot apply to developed and less developed countries.
中国承认并且尊重人权的普遍性原则，但同时我们也认为，人权的普遍性原则必须与各国的国情相结合。
And too often, states and the United Nations are unwilling or incapable of matching their rhetoric with action.
Rwanda didn't suffer from ancient hatreds between Hutu killers and Tutsi victims. It suffered from those who were willing to kill in the warped name of ethnic difference, from those who saw division and death as a path to power. And it suffered from an international community, international institutions, and individual governments, including my own, that failed to act in the face of a vast, unfolding evil.
Nevertheless, people around the globe, regardless of race, creed, nationality, gender, or other status, continue to press for acknowledgement of their human rights. It remains to be seen whether their calls will be heard.